Audio check. All right, well, good morning. I show 10 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. We are here on the record in docket number 23-08-32-WQ01, the Connecticut Water Company's 2025 request for approval of its Water Quality and Treatment Assessment Report. I am Russ Bowman, a staff attorney here with the authority, and we are here today for a staff-led technical meeting. Accordingly, in just a moment, I'll turn the proceeding over to Mr. Peter Kramer, the director of the authority's technical staff. But before doing so, I'll ask for any present attorneys to offer an appearance for the record.
Morning, Mr. Bowman. David Bogan, along with Colleen Olson from the law firm of Day Pitney on behalf of Connecticut Water Company.
Thank you, sir. Good morning and welcome. Anyone else? All right, Mr. Kramer.
Thank you, Attorney Bowman. Good morning to the company and to the panel. As Attorney Bowman mentioned, my name is Peter Kramer. I'm the Director of Technical Staff here with the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority, and appreciate you coming in for our discussion today on the water quality application. I'll start just by outlining the process for our meeting, our discussion today. First off, our objective is through the discussion today to discuss the format and content of the submitted application and the prioritization of proposed projects and other related topics as needed. Second, for some housekeeping items, I'd like to point out that this technical meeting is being broadcast live on PURA's YouTube channel, and the recording of the live stream can be found there after the meeting. We're also joined by our court reporter today, and the transcript of the meeting will be posted to PURA's website in docket information when it's available. Next up, our microphones. Please ensure that your microphone is on, as indicated by the little green light at the base, and speak into the microphone. It would be important for folks in the room to hear us. However, it's just us today in the room, so it's important for folks at home to be able to hear and follow along as such. Thank you, Robin. Next, let's see. Similarly, when we run these roundtable discussions and have more participants, we often have some ground rules about conferring with members of the audience or members of the audience being recognized to speak. Not the case today, but just for awareness with this format that we've been using over the last year to 18 months. But relevant to today and our discussion format, we understand that the company has put a presentation into the record, and so we'll start with the company's presentation and open the substance of our technical meeting with that presentation from the company. Then we will move on to some staff-led questions about the application, generally in the topics of, as I mentioned earlier, format and content of the filings, but also the proposed project prioritization and other relevant topics for the water quality application in front of us. So we do aim to keep this conversation-based, discussion-based. So any one of the authority staff up here may ask a follow-up question. Certainly feel free to ask us clarifying questions about what information we're seeking, so that we can all develop a better understanding of the application and the proposal in front of the authority. So with that, I should have mentioned at the outset that I'm joined by authority staff here at the table, Supervisor Jim Vocalina, Engineer Maria Suzel, and Research Analyst Mark Benedetti sitting behind me. And with that, let's get to introductions from the company, please. If you could each state your name and title and affiliation for the record, please.
My name is Troy Dixon. I'm Vice President of Regulatory Affairs for Connecticut Water.
Good morning. I'm David Peeling, Vice President of Engineering and Operations, Connecticut Water.
Very good. Thank you and welcome. And Attorney Bowman, unless there's anything else, I think we can move on to the company's presentation to get us started. Please.
All right. We were talking a little bit before we started that it's not too often that we have something new in the water space. So we appreciate the opportunity to be in here and talk to you about it. I think Mr. Vocalina and I were saying about 15 years or so ago, we introduced the WICA mechanism And I think this is the sort of the next largest thing to come about since then. So we set up a presentation more or less to guide things a little bit, but we're happy to go wherever makes sense. And I think some of the things we hope to cover here will maybe address some of the things that you wanted to get to later as well. We structured it into two real segments. One is an engineering review, where Mr. Peeling will talk about some of the status of the regulation, some of the scoring, the different tiers that we use. And then we'll sort of segment off into a piece where I've listed it on here as semi-annual filing, but I already botched it on the agenda here, the annual filing, because I think as much as this docket is about the assessment report, we need to talk a little bit about what the process looks like as we get into the annual filings, so that there are no surprises there. With that said, I'll turn it over to Dave for the engineering part.
I'm not sure. So while we wait for the slides to come up here, yeah, and I think we can go right to the next slide as well. So I'm going to give a little bit of technical background here and context for how we thought about going through the WQTA report development. So just a little background that will hopefully inform the discussion. I don't mean to be lecturing, so just stop me anywhere along the way here if there's some things we want to talk about. Right at the top there is the timeline for the regulation. So it seemed like this was sort of a foundational piece for us to just have on our mind as we have the conversation today. The regulation for PFAS went into effect in 2024, last year, April of 2024. And I lifted this graphic off of a legal website, but it shows well that there's a 3-year period from 24 to 2027. And all that's required during that period is monitoring and testing the drinking water. There's a 12-month average of water samples that needs to be built over that time. So it's giving a bit of a cushion there to get that accomplished. But what I think is important is behind that, you've got from 2027 to 2029 for full compliance. So that's a pretty tight window when you're talking about potentially large construction projects or capital improvements. So we'll talk a little bit as we did the tiering, that kind of plays into it, sort of our goal to make sure we're in compliance at all locations in 2029 versus, still collecting some of our upfront sampling right now. So that's the rough timeline we're working on. So that first period, the initial monitoring, that's where we are right now. That's collecting samples from all our sources. The compliance is based on a running annual average, and that's based at the point of entry. So not a well by itself or individual sources. That's at the point of entry into the distribution system, post-treatment or post whatever pumping system we might have in place. For surface water and groundwater sources, if any surface water source or groundwater source is larger than 10,000 customers, that's a quarterly sample. So you have to collect 4 samples within a 12-month period, and that becomes your running average. And then you would continue on, obviously, quarterly after that, and it would become just a running average at that point. But for small groundwater systems, less than 10,000 customers, it's just 2 samples semi-annually within a 12-month period. And the one quirk of the running annual average I wanted to mention is the way the results are being calculated. If there's a result below the 4 parts per trillion threshold, that's our regulatory threshold for PFOS, PFAS, it counts as 0 for the purposes of running annual average. So that creates a little bit of a uncertain result until you get all your sample results in hand. I've just put an example down there that if you had 3 quarters at 5 parts per trillion, but the 4th quarter came back as 3 parts per trillion, that 3 would count as a 0, which would bring your running annual average below 4. And suddenly you meet your MCL, even though most of those data points exceeded it. So that's a little counterintuitive, but that's how the regulation is written.
Mr. Peeling, sorry to interrupt. I think your last point clarifies this, but just for the record, these are federal regulations you're referring
That's
to.
correct, federal
Okay.
regulations. And the compliance date to have your running annual average below 4 parts at the point of entry is April 2029. The federal government, EPA, has signaled that they expect to extend that compliance period out to 2031, but that is not, that hasn't been put forth in any formal way over a comment period. I think that would be either later this year or next year where that might be discussed, but I just wanted to put that out in the open. So, but we're still operating under that April 2029 deadline unless there was a formal change in regulation. All right. We can go to the next slide unless there are topics on the regs we wanted to talk about. All right, and then just quick overview on the engineering piece, the treatment piece. The two best accepted practice treatment mechanisms for PFAS removal right now are ion exchange or granular activated carbon. There are other techniques. You can interconnect your system to one that's not, doesn't have presence of contamination. The reg also permits blending as an acceptable mechanism, since the compliance point is point of entry as opposed to individual sources. Blending would be an option. But as far as treatment goes, these are the two primary methodologies that are available to us. Ion exchange is typically a proprietary material that a vendor will have their unique manufactured resin material that they'll supply to us for PFAS removal specifically. The water runs through that vessel and absorbs to the media. So absorption means it's physically connecting to that particle and staying locked in place going forward. And you can operate that vessel until all those sites are filled, or to the point you start having some breakthrough of PFAS because there's more loading than sites available to absorb. At that point, the vessel would be returned to the vendor for disposal, and that would be the mechanism. There's no backwash. There's no other real treatment methodology there. You just run your water supply through those vessels and remove the PFAS, typically in a lead lag sort of configuration. So if you start to have breakthrough in a lead vessel, your customers are still protected while you address that breakthrough on the first vessel. Carbon is a pretty similar mechanism. This is a non-proprietary media, very common in water treatment. GAC, granular activated carbon, each granule is highly porous, so very high surface area, even though it's a tiny little particle. And it's the same mechanism, adsorption of the PFAS to that carbon media particle. And again, it stays locked in place there over the course of treatment. One difference with GAC is you typically will catch some other constituents in the water supply and require some backwash to make sure you're not channeling flow, you're not blocking flow. You've kind of got a good even loading rate across your carbon over time. The backwash does not knock off the PFAS in any meaningful way since the PFAS is adsorbed to that particle. So again, you really are operating that as a flow-through treatment mechanism until you see signs of PFAS breakthrough. Excuse me. And at that point, the GAC is returned to the vendor, and they go through a regeneration process on that, which is a high temperature, burns off the materials that have been adsorbed to the carbon, in this case, the PFAS, and then the carbon can be returned to service at that point. GAC tends to be a little more cost-effective in large applications. Ion exchange seems cost competitive at some of the smaller applications. It is kind of case by case, and there's constant efforts to improve the technology out there. But that has been sort of what we're seeing, and what our plan is built around is those IX units tend to be most effective and cost-effective at some of the smaller loading rates versus the GAC. Any questions on the treatment piece?
And good morning, Maria Shore. Would you please explain how granular activated carbon is more tolerant to chlorine than ion exchange? I understand that once the PFAS is removed, then you can treat water. I understand that chlorine is used for disinfection. Is this correct?
Correct.
So how chlorine will be used together with the granular activated carbon? I understand that it should be used after the water goes through the GAC filter.
Yep.
Is this correct?
Yeah, so in normal circumstances, you're exactly right. You dose the chlorine at the end of the process for your disinfection residual in the distribution system. But many of our sources in Connecticut have other water quality issues, specifically iron and manganese is pretty common with our groundwater sources. And sometimes we need to pre-chlorinate or oxidate to bring those constituents into a solid form so we can filter them out as another step in the treatment process. So I think the fact GAC is more tolerant to chlorine kind of gives us a little safety net in case any chlorine makes it through that initial iron and manganese removal process and carries over into the PFAS removal process, that we wouldn't damage our media. It could tolerate that.
Okay, so this means that you sometimes may add chlorine at the beginning of the process.
If we add chlorine earlier in the process, it's for another treatment objective. The PFAS removal wouldn't require the chlorine to be required. The PFAS is purely the adsorption mechanism.
Okay, now another question is regarding the vendor and disposal. Is the company planning to inspect those vendors and how the disposal process will take place, just in case the company is not called responsible for any pollution in the future? What is your thought about?
We hadn't planned on doing an independent inspection. It would be sort of like any sort of hazardous material transfer, that there's a chain of custody and the vendor would own the liability and responsibility to dispose of that in compliance with regulation. So I think we would just rely, our plan had been just to rely on that responsibility.
Okay, I'm sorry. So once you sign the chain of custody, everything is in vendor's hands.
Correct.
That's how you see it.
Yeah.
Regarding backwash residues, do you think that there will be just a trace of PFAS in the backwash water, or there will not be at all PFAS?
The expectation would be there'd be nothing detectable. It looks like the literature suggests it's possible some molecules could be jostled free just from, physical contact or some other mechanism there during the backwash, but it's nothing meaningful or probably measurable that would be coming off of that. I think the detection limit right now, I think, is 2 parts per trillion at the laboratories still. So we're very close. The MCL is not much above what the lab can even detect. So that 2 parts per trillion certainly would not be coming off during a backwash process.
Where the water from backwash will go will be disposed of to the municipal wastewater treatment or another place?
Wherever the current process disposes of it. So if there's a sewer locally, it would be to that sewer. If we have a lagoon system or drying bed system, it would be disposed to that.
Did you have a chance to talk with municipalities regarding disposal of this backwash water if you send this through sewer to municipalities?
We haven't had those conversations. Again, the expectations, we wouldn't be loading them with any meaningful amount of PFAS that they would have to deal with. So we hadn't pursued anything on that.
Thank you. That's all my questions.
Okay.
If I may, just a follow-up on the treatment methods. And you mentioned this a little bit in sort of identifying the two different types here, but how does the company determine whether a project should use ion exchange or the granular activated carbon method?
So we completed an implementation plan with a consultant that I think we referenced in the WQTA. And what we really, there are a bunch of factors for every site. It's the water quality, the constituents in that specific site. It's the volume, the treated volume required, the space potentially available in an existing facility or building a new facility or the site. So we asked a consultant to help us go through every single location and assess what looked like the better treatment fit, given that water chemistry, given the site constraints, given the cost. And that's a life cycle cost we looked at as well for the change out of media types. And we've landed on a recommendation that was the basis of our initial set of cost estimates and our initial assumption here on treatment technology. And even then, we're trying to leave ourselves a little latitude that as we get into the design phase, if we get into some specifics there, we could always make an adjustment at that point. But that's how we kind of took our first swing at it.
Understood. And I saw the factors that were included in the application, and I'm wondering if the company can explain any further how those factors are weighted, if it's truly on a case-by-case basis as you're describing, or is there some sort of methodology used to determine? I'm seeing, I think it's page 5 of the WQTA assessment report in topic number 3, where water quality, capital cost, O&M cost, media change out frequency, space constraints, footprint, parcel size, disposal, site permitting, those factors you just described.
Oh, I don't remember if we had specific numbers, criteria. I don't, we didn't assign a specific weighting formula to it, but as we talk over here, water quality and size and space constraints seem to be the driving factors for us. So water quality, obviously, if we have to have effective treatment, so that becomes a primary driver. And the reason space and size was a driver is the footprint of an ion exchange unit is typically a little smaller than for a GAC unit. So we wanted to assess if we had an existing facility, if we could fit some treatment equipment in that facility, we could save ourselves a lot of construction cost for a larger new facility. And then, or if we had to build a new facility, the constraints of that site and the footprint of a new structure based on offsets and property line and things like that become very important to the feasibility of an approach. So I guess, you know, I think we attached the report. You can see we kind of provided each of those items and then left it to a little more of a qualitative determination on what the best treatment technology would look like it would be under those criteria.
Okay, thank you. And you alluded to this in the presentation, but is there a material cost difference between either one of these two most common treatment methods that you've included?
Yeah, so the ion exchange media is substantially more expensive than the carbon media, but it also can have a longer effective life and smaller treatment vessels associated with it. So there is a little bit of a back and forth based on your loading rates, the concentration of PFAS you're trying to remove, so you can develop a life cycle cost for so many cubic feet of media replacement on such and such an interval at such and such a price difference. Which one looks like it's the better long-term cost?
Understood. The life cycle cost you're referring to includes cost of disposal, or maybe you can define for us when you're saying the life cycle cost, what does that include?
Yeah, I think we carried our normal disposal costs. Again, it wasn't a substantial cost because of the case of ion exchange. It would be disposing through that vendor, usually on a pretty long cycle, multiple years would be the expectation on that. And carbon, we did factor in that regeneration and return cost based on our current experience on how we send that back to Calgon to get regenerated. So those costs are carried in those life cycle estimates.
Okay. And do the proposed projects, the estimates that were provided for the projects included in the application include the cost of disposal?
I think it's purely the capital number that we provided in the report. So we use the life cycle to assess technology fit. And then when we landed on what we thought would be the most appropriate treatment technology, we developed a capital cost to accommodate that treatment. And that's what we reflected in the report.
Understood. In that case, then where would the cost for disposal appear for the company in future filings?
It would be part of the alternatives analysis that to some degree we're doing on, I'm sorry. Yeah, and the O&M budgeting as well. Yeah, so it would be reflected. I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
Where the cost of disposal for the ion exchange and GAC methods would appear in future filings. If the costs are not included in the application because this is capital costs only, then where would the authority or any other stakeholder see the costs of disposal for these treatment methods in the future?
I think generally we think it's going to be as part of a regular rate case is when you're first going to see that as an O&M component of the rate case, unless it becomes something a little bit more significant, at which point we would probably seek a deferral or something like that. But generally the O&M costs are not going to be part of these filings.
Understood. Thank you. I think that's all for me on these technologies for the moment.
You mentioned you've gone through the various treatment methods with your consultant to determine which one was appropriate for each individual site. Is that something that you provide in future WQTAs attached to the project summaries that led you to that conclusion that that was the most appropriate treatment method?
I think as each project moves along its timeline, we can provide more and more detail on where we land on things like the treatment technology chosen. So I don't recall how specific we were on alternatives in some of these project summaries at this point, but you know, that's certainly part of our process is optimizing the treatment technology so that if there's some documentation.
That's something you've currently done for all of the, except for I believe there's 3 projects out there that you've determined the treatment on your own without the consultant. Is that the case? I believe I read that.
So the consultant gave us recommendations. There were 3 that we didn't because I think we had installed at one location and we were in progress at a second location. So we didn't need them we were already in the design phase and we were asking them to look sort of pre-concept. So there was no value in having them assess at that high planning level.
You've made your, lack for a better term, your own decision tree, which led you to your form of treatment for those 3.
Correct.
Which you can provide.
A traditional design process or alternatives analysis process.
For the other ones, you've worked with your consultant and they provided you, or you've worked in concert to come up with what was the most appropriate treatment for the other 30 plus projects. So you have that.
Correct. And really remember, based on that timeline, the reason we wanted to get that consultant looking at all those additional sites is we had to get our arms around what the program needed to look like to meet that compliance deadline, which feels right around the corner for a large construction program like this. So it's a first cut at what looks like the best fit. And then as we advance through the traditional design process and more detail, we'd have more and more documentation on the decision making.
Do you think it would be to the point where it would change the form of treatment?
It's possible,
Yeah.
yeah, because the amount of time and effort per site at this high level analysis and the data available is, we've only had preliminary sample results for some of these sites when the first report was done. We'll have other designs now that have completed their entire running annual average by the time we're in design. So we might have a different picture on what we're trying to accomplish as a design objective, and that could change the optimization.
Subject to update. I'm just thinking the WICA filings that you have and things that change in that for a project, you file changes subsequently. So we're looking at the same sort of scenario here.
Yeah, for this assessment report will be a living, breathing document. So every time we file an annual surcharge request, that report will be attached and it'll be redlined, marked for any changes, and we're going to highlight what has changed since the last time we put it out there. So it should be pretty clear if something changes along the way.
So I have a few more questions. Regarding the treatment methods, is the company considering to look at other methods? Because as we speak now, there are so many other people who are coming up with the treatment for PFAS. What is your thought about this?
We are open to all good ideas that accomplish our treatment goal. So a lot of that technology is a little new, and it's maybe not as established, and in general, it's very costly. So it's sort of niche applications for a lot of those. But we do not limit the designers on this. We're asking them for the best treatment solution. We're providing some of our initial assessment work and asking them to, initiate the design and look at what's out there and give us the best result.
Regarding PFAS tests, are all your sites with water, wells or lakes, reservoirs, are tested for PFAS, or you are still in the process of testing of those sites?
We're still in the process of testing. That said, I think we at least have initial samples from nearly every single source. The only exception would be some of those very small systems where we only have the 2 compliance samples required, and we might have done a preliminary sample before the regulation was finalized that indicate we didn't have the presence of PFAS there. There might be a couple of those that we haven't collected data on, but otherwise we have a pretty good set of water sample data from most sites, and we're expecting all sources that we routinely utilize. So, not the seasonals, all the primary sources will have our running annual average compliance sampling done by first quarter 2026, second quarter 2026.
So recently you follow the federal PFAS regulations.
Correct.
Do you think that Department of Public Health will develop its own sets of rules, or you will always follow only federal regulation? Do you know something about?
Yeah, my opinion is Department of Public Health will stick with the federal regulation. That's always been the precedent. There's been no indication they would depart from that. Legislatively, I guess you never know if Connecticut did something out of left field, that would be the difference, but otherwise, I wouldn't expect it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. The reason I'm asking is because usually when state develops regulations that are more stringent than federal. So are you ready for this?
The advantage of these treatment technologies is they treat to non-detect. They absorb, as long as there is capacity for the media to gather up PFAS, it keeps collecting PFAS, and you should have nothing coming through. So if the detection limit was lowered or the MCL was lowered, having treatment in place should address that. That said, the detection limit isn't a heck of a lot lower than the MCL right now, so there's not a lot of latitude for the state to get too much more stringent. But even if the threshold was 2, these treatment technologies would still be what we would select and be confident we'd be at non-detect.
So you mentioned also the deadline for PFAS removal. It is April of 2029.
Correct.
Do you think it will be extended to 2031? Because I've heard somewhere the number 2031.
That's what US EPA announced. That was their intent to extend it to 2031. So, but I don't know what's involved in their regulatory process to make that official and how to handicap the likelihood that'll happen, but it's certainly a possibility.
Would this help you if the time would be extended? Would this help you to fulfill all PFAS regulations? Or are you ready for 2029?
We've built the program to be ready for 2029. But you know, from construction, when you look at the number of construction projects we have and the number of sites we have and just Murphy's Law, there's always a challenge getting that number of construction projects completed by a specific deadline. We've built the program to do that and to give us a little bit of latitude. But if we were extended out to 2031, that would certainly reduce our risk of having any systems where we had levels over the MCL as of April 2029.
Who will complete those projects? Connecticut Water employees, or you will hire contractors?
In almost all cases, it'll be a contractor. In a lot of these cases, we're having to build a building or an addition to go with it, so it's well beyond what we could do internally. The exception is some of our small systems. We can't, where it's some, and I have some pictures coming up here where it's smaller equipment that can fit in an existing structure, get plumbed into place. That type of work we can do and have done internally. So, but you can assume the vast majority would be contractors who we'd bid to.
How many contractors you would need to hire in order to be compliant with the deadline 2029? Do you know now? Or
It's a great point. So we've put a lot of thought into that because we have concern that if we bid everything at the same date, there aren't enough contractors in Connecticut to cover all those projects. So if you look at our plan, we have tried to stagger the dates. That's part of that tiering structure we're going to talk a little bit about, is try and make sure we get people on the top priorities and give ourselves a little stagger so we keep contractors busy without overwhelming the pool. We've looked at potentially, we haven't made decisions, but do we bid as a bundle some projects geographically? Maybe that's a way for some efficiency to be achieved. Maybe we pursue design build procurement approach on some of these to try and accelerate delivery and keep contractors able to move on to other projects. But it's a real issue that's on our mind for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maria. Before we go on to the remainder of the presentation and some of the tiering that I know you've included, I heard you, Mr. Peeling, talk about the testing and that the initial compliance testing is expected to be completed in the first quarter of 26. Is that right?
Definitely by the second quarter. I think it's the first quarter, though. I just don't have the sampling dates in front of me.
Just to help me understand, if the testing is not yet complete, is why the application at this point in time? What are we going to learn through the additional testing that is not already known now versus if you have enough information to submit the application now, the testing that's ongoing will do what?
So the testing that's ongoing is the regulation required compliance testing. Our concern was the amount of time it would take if we waited until the first or second quarter of 2026 to have all those results in hand. And then we sat down and said, okay, how are we going to attack these projects? We would have lost so much time on the clock there that completing all that construction by 2029, that would even, we're completing our compliance sampling a year ahead of deadline, and we still would only have 3 years for a construction program of this magnitude. It just didn't feel feasible to us. So what we did was look at when we had initial samples, maybe the initial results are so elevated, our expectation is there's no way that running annual average will realistically drop down to below the MCL. So let's get this project initiated now so we can make some progress and give ourselves the best chance of having that project completed early enough so as other compliance sampling results come in, we have some bandwidth to tackle those as they become known. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
I think my question was a little convoluted, but I think you are answering the question insofar as the testing that's been complete to date is enough to indicate that you know you need to act in order to comply with the regulations. My question about the nature of the ongoing testing, I guess, is getting at whether the list of 35 projects, and with the qualifier that you've said clearly that you expect this to be a living, breathing document, but is it expected with the information you have now that the list of 35 projects would be exhaustive for the company's needs to comply with the federal regulations?
Not necessarily, and it can go both ways. Like I gave the example there of those multiple samples above the MCL, and then the fourth one is low, and suddenly maybe a project we'd been planning and tracking drops off the list, or vice versa. We could have something where we had initial preliminary sampling or initial samples that looked like it would be below the MCL, and for some reason, seasonally, we collected higher samples and it gets added to this list. So the 35 projects could, be added to, or a few of those could come off the list. That's something that we would have to constantly update and explain what the basis is for that. But thankfully, once we get past this 2026, initial round of compliance sampling, we'll have a much clearer view of that because we will have a full 12-month sampling record for all of these sources that we'd be basing our plan on. So at that point, variation would be much less than it is in these early stages.
Tier 1 is due comprehensive list.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Troy's making the point that if all the tiers represented, tier 1 through 4 represents really the whole universe of what we think could potentially require treatment. There's some of those that we're just tracking because it had an initial result that maybe was below MCL. Really don't expect there to be a need there, but we're going to track that as a possibility and put it in that lowest tier. So we at least have that on our radar. So movement between tiers is certainly a possibility as we have those additional results, but probably the 1 through 4 set of projects represents the broader potential range for us.
And
I'm just mentioning here that we do have additional samples for beyond just the compliance sampling for some sources of particular interest to us. So that would be a case where we started voluntarily sampling very early on because we realized we had a critical source that if it needed treatment, we had to be on the ball to make sure we didn't lose that source for any extended period of time. So we do have some sources where we built up a pretty substantial sample record at this point. So just wanted to make that point as well.
That anticipated part of my next question, which is whether the initial testing that the company's completed is only taking place at the points of entry, or if there are other areas of the system that are also being tested. And it sounds like the answer is yes, other areas.
It's not the distribution system, but the individual well sources are being tested because we wanted to zero in on the treatment need. So if we have 4 wells feeding a point of entry and our point of entry is over the MCL, instead of assuming that we had to treat for that full volume of all 4 wells, if it happened there was 1 well that needs treatment, maybe we'd be better served treating that individual source at a smaller scale, less cost than global. So we do have additional samples for individual sources or repeat samples where we were getting conflicting results. We had some results early on when the labs were new to this and people were new to collecting samples where we might have a 0 at the well, but a positive at the point of entry, which obviously is impossible. So we'd go back and repeat some samples to get some greater confidence in what was going on. So any number of things like that would be the reason we'd have a longer data record at this point.
Thank you. Any other? Go ahead.
So I have another question regarding your testing, your samples. Let's assume that one sample is 0 and another sample is 5. Are you required to report both values or just one? 0 PFAS is the same well. One sample has 0 of PFAS and another has 5, and they are taken at the same time. Let's say you wanted to do 2 samples instead of 1. Which one you are reporting? Both of them, both of those results, or just one?
I would want to confirm some of the mechanics. I don't want to misstate anything, but if we're in the official compliance period where we're collecting samples that are going in as the basis of our compliance, typically if you take the sample, you have to report that sample. So if we had 2 samples with different results, we would have to report them both. I would assume for regulatory purposes, the higher one is what we'd be measured against. But because that's kind of confusing, I think our goal is just a single sample during each quarter for our compliance period. The reason we had those additional samples early on is we didn't have that reporting requirement. We were information gathering for ourselves and building a plan for ourselves. So we had some more frequent and multiple sample situations. Less likely we would do that now.
Thank you.
I think we can move on to
All right,
the
next.
in the presentation. Thank you for answering those questions.
Perfect. Yeah. 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 Yeah, we can move on. All right, so this is just gee whiz stuff. Thought it would be helpful to show a few pictures here of the treatment technologies for physical removal of PFAS. Troy just mentions to me, though, just to make the point to you that in our list of projects, we do have projects that are interconnection projects, which would preclude the need for this type of treatment technology. The idea would be if we have a small system in the vicinity of a large system and the large system is has the margin of safety and is below our PFAS MCL, the most cost-effective approach is often just to tie those systems together and make it one single PWSID. So that is always on the table. But if we are looking at PFAS removal, this gives you an idea of the scale of 3 different representative sizes. The one on the far left there is the Westchester East Ion Exchange System. And you can kind of see from that lower photograph, it's sort of a skid-mounted, more manageable size vessels. You can sometimes find the floor space in an existing facility to get that in, tie it into the process, and run in series through those vessels for the PFAS removal. So that's sort of the small end of the scale. In the middle is our Avon Well 3, about 300 gallon per minute capacity there. That's just recently been finished construction. So you can see those vessels, which, you know, they're about 6 feet, 8 feet tall, I think was the height of those. So it's certainly larger. That's where we have a contractor involved. We're not tackling that ourselves, but it gives you an idea of the scale of that project and the things like the head space you need in the existing facility to make that installation, the floor space you need for this size vessel. And the third set on the far right there, this is not a Connecticut water project. This is just for illustration purposes in Westfield, Massachusetts. This is a 3MGD GAC facility. So this is exactly what we would install for one of our larger well fields if we have to treat with GAC. So you can see there's a whole different scale to those vessels, the complexity and the building requirements that would be associated with something that size compared to, you know, some of those very small systems. Any questions on that? I think it's just kind of fun to see.
So regarding the GAC, this is that those filters are shown, or I can see the best on the top of the picture. Those are the filters.
Under City of Westfield,
Yeah.
yes, those are the filter vessels. Yeah, those large, every one of those is filled with carbon for removal.
Okay. And you can install as many as you need to remove the PFAS, as long as you have enough space in.
That's exactly right. So usually the treatment flow rate starts, there's only so big those vessels get. It's about a 12-foot diameter. These are quite tall, you can see. But at that point, you have to stay within a design range for the loading rate of that media. So if you have higher flow rates, you just keep adding vessels until you get to an acceptable low rate. So I've seen images from out west where they'll have 24 vessels, planned, because that's how many they have to get that loading rate in design range. So that's how it would work.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I think we can get to my last slide here. And this was just, I think we covered a lot of this. This is just a review of our tiering structure. And again, we just wanted to make clear the logic here was because of the time frame we have to construct under. We really needed to prioritize and make sure we had a plan that got us in the best position for full compliance in a pretty short time frame. So what we definitely wanted to prioritize was anything we felt like looked like it was certainly going to be over the MCL and was a crucial source for us because we didn't have adequate redundancy behind it. If we have some redundancy, we felt like, well, maybe there's a way for us to keep that source offline in 2029 if it's not addressed and rely on redundant sources. So maybe that takes some of the criticality out of those projects. So we'll define that as one lower tier. We called tier 3 projects where these are the ones that are a closer call to your question of what could our number change. These are the projects where either maybe we're at 3 parts per trillion on some of our early sampling or just above 4, or we have some different results over multiple samples. So these are the ones that are most likely to jump up or down, either up to tier 2 or down to tier 4 as we get more data on it. But we still wanted to represent these projects in the plan and build them into the plan so we weren't caught flat-footed if we needed to proceed on them. And then tier 4, like I mentioned earlier, it looks like we're going to be within the regulatory limit, but we still want to track because we detected something there and we felt like we needed to give that some extra attention. So of the 35 projects in the 4 tiers that we submitted, 26 of those are tier 1 and 2. So the majority are, things were priority projects for us. And then we have 9 of them in tier 3 right now. And we didn't submit the tier 4 because we felt like that wasn't a sure enough project to make it worth the authority's review at this point.
Regarding 9 projects, tier 3, you won't have to complete them by 2029.
We do, but we're playing the odds a little on those, saying it's possible we might not even have to treat. So we don't want to put our resources into those projects first. Let's focus on the ones we know we have to address, the tier 1, the tier 2. Let's let the compliance sampling period play out for those borderline cases, and then we can initiate those later on once we have a firmer idea, but they all are subject to that same 2029 deadline right now.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. So I misinterpreted that. The tier 3 and the federal guidelines state that anything that's 75. Well, why would the tier 3 need to be completed by 2029? I think that had to be at the end.
Anything where the compliance sampling, so those 4 quarterly samples, if that exceeds 4 parts per trillion at the point of entry, that must be addressed by April 2029. So what we're reflecting with tier 3 is we have some data that says either it's close to that MCL or it could be over. So if it turns out it's below, then we would not have a compliance requirement because our point of entry would be below 4 in 2029, which is our measurement
Okay, I
criteria.
just want to make sure I understood.
Yeah, yeah.
If it's below 4, there is no requirement by 2029, and you're showing here that the tier 3 are less than 75% of the.
Yeah, essentially, I think that's saying over 3 parts per trillion. We've measured something over 3 parts per trillion at least, right? So if it was 3.7, we might not feel comfortable saying we're taking that off the list. We're just going to track that because it could bump up, and then we've got to initiate a project for it.
Just a question on one thing you didn't anticipate, I guess, were the additional land that you may need to procure. So when you went and you looked at all these different treatments and what it would require, the large treatments with buildings would be required. There's been no assessment so far of going out and seeing what land the company owns at this point. And
There have been assessments along that. The planning team's done a few subsequent to this submission, has done some specific site assessments. What we did in that initial implementation plan was applied some typical square footages for treatment of that size, so we could assess whether it seemed like that site might be, the existing sites would be realistic or not. And in this case where it looked like we would not have sufficient space or it needs further investigation, we initiated some follow-on alternatives analysis to say, well, do we need to procure property for this? Do we need to seek easements? Do we have what we need, or is that another step in this process we have to build into the plan?
And what did that further analysis indicate, that these sites do have sufficient space, or you're in a situation where you're going to need to procure either
The majority of
from any of these or a few of these or get easements?
I'd say the majority, we feel comfortable there's going to be space available on our existing properties. But there are a handful, under 10, where we've identified either some property rights limitations or just parcel size constraints that need some attention. Either we need to come up with a different approach, or that's where we might look more seriously at a more costly interconnection. If we don't have the space on the site, let's do a cost analysis and determine the best approach. There was a site where it's an association where we don't even have property rights beyond what's currently in place as a legacy system. So how do we establish that to achieve even just a small area to construct? So the planning team's working through those limited number of sites right now.
Okay. Going back to the tiers, while you've provided in your assessment report here, projects through tier 3, you're going to be focusing on tier 1 and tier 2 exclusively for what I'll call the equivalent to the semi-annual filing reports when you come in and seek recovery for these. We're not going to be, you're going to monitor the tier 1 or the tier 3 projects with future sampling. And if they're not exceeding that level, those are not going to be completed. I guess the prioritization is going to be tier 1 and tier 2. I'm stating the obvious or not, but I'm asking the question.
Yes, tier 1 and tier 2 are the priorities.
We should not see any tier 3 coming in for cost recovery until subsequent sampling has moved them into another tier.
I think that's fair to say. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's fair to say. Yeah, so Troy's making the point to me here, that tier 1 and tier 2 projects would be the ones we would be pursuing recovery through the WQTA. But some further thought would need to go into whether a site that might be technically below the MCL still represents a case where it warrants treatment for the benefit of the customer through a general rate case proceeding. So that would be a more traditional approach if we felt like, in the case of that one that we had three samples that were over and one under, we felt like the customers really aren't well served here, but that would be outside the
Okay, which is
WQTA
in the
process.
Case as
Right.
opposed to a surcharge here.
Correct. Yep.
Okay, yeah. Other question?
Is it accurate to assume that the absence of tier 4 projects indicates that the entirety of or all of the points of entry are testing at least 75% of the MCL? Or are there tier 4 projects or tier 4 locations that we're sort of not seeing projects for because they are below the MCL?
We did not include any tier 4 projects on that list of 35 because we felt like it was a low enough probability a project would develop there. It didn't seem worth the authority's review time and, treating it like a project until there was more evidence to support that. Is that answering the question?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. And so from the overview you gave, Mr. Peeling, there's essentially 2 criteria that it sounds like went into determining tier 1 and 2. It's the level of whether the testing exceeds the MCL and then the presence of redundant supply. Are those the 2 criteria essentially that led to the tiering structure the company is using here?
Those were the foundational criteria. And then within that, as we started laying out the full program, there were other considerations we might have built into that as far as the timing of the tier wouldn't change in those projects, but the timing of some of the projects might shift depending on that project's needs. For example, if we're pursuing SRF funding for a project, we're aware there's a longer time to get DPH approval of the plans and authority to bid and authority to award. So that might be a project that has a different timeline than something not eligible for SRF funding. So we might treat those a little different in our prioritization for launching the project, though they might both be tier 1.
I see. So within tier 1 and 2, there's additional prioritization that may lead to different timing consideration or timing to initiate a project.
Yeah.
So you mentioned SRF funding is one of those. What might be some of the other criteria that the company considers in terms of prioritizing within tier 1 or tier 2?
All the things we've talked about, it could be site constraints, it could be things like flood elevations or land rights or the size of the vessels or the complexity of that treatment process. If it requires a full new structure versus we have something in place that we think we can utilize. And really, it's case by case what the circumstances are. And the tiering really was mostly for our internal benefit to organize our thinking. We knew we had such a long list to try and go through all 36 and assess all those different criteria of what sort of timeline it would take to complete it and what are the factors we need to build in here and what are the other treatment challenges for this site and everything we need to consider. The tiering helped us focus our efforts on where the need was greatest based on those foundational requirements of the MCL and no redundancy. And then we would assess the rest to see when we need to initiate a project, always with the goal of the April 2029 deadline in mind. What do we need to do now to get us best positioned to meet April 2029 based on each individual project?
Understood. So it sounds like many of the other criteria considered within the tiers and how a project is sequenced or when it's initiated are often project-based, and I mean, the construction process of siting or materials or other considerations for executing the timeline. And I'm curious if the number of customers served for a given point of entry or a point within the system, was that at all a consideration, or was it more the within the prioritization, or was it really more of the project-based sort of execution criteria that you were describing earlier?
I think all those things factor in a qualitative way. Some of our largest systems have redundancy, so there might, the number of customers might not be a cleanest number by itself. And also the number of customers matter, whether we have a lot of them for a treated system or a few. We owe them the same level of treatment performance. But that's one of multiple factors I think we'd think about. If we can address for large numbers of people early in the program, that's favorable. Let's get PFAS out as quickly as possible for the most people we can within those other constraints, so the overall program meets its compliance deadline.
I think those are all the questions I had on tiers. Did you have others?
Regarding tiers, they are required now for PFAS removal. Will this program be used for any other water treatment after the PFAS is under control, if I can say that, or is in compliance, you are in compliance with PFAS regulations?
Would the WQTA be used once we're in compliant for PFAS?
Yes.
I don't think so. I think the legislation requires that we'd have to have a regulated contaminant. Troy, help me out here.
Yeah, so the WQTA is applicable to any new regulation after a certain date. So if a new regulation surfaces, manganese, that would come through this program as well. Would you be using the same tier structure to evaluate? That's probably more based on the particular regulation, I would assume.
Yes, that's fair to say that the tier structure was what we came up with specific to PFAS because we had so many sites we had to organize around. We built this specifically for PFAS. If there was a future contaminant under the WQTA, we might handle it differently.
Thank you.
Next
I
slide.
think we're ready to move on.
So the next section is really looking at more of assuming the assessment report is accepted and we have eligibility determination. This is really about implementation. Are we okay to go to that now, or? Okay. At a high level, when the legislation was being drafted, we modeled it after the current WICA program. So we started with WICA, and then there were changes that were made. And what I wanted to do is I put a table in here to really highlight the places where there are differences between how the two are treated. So I think the most significant thing is from a what is recovered basis. When we think about WICA, completed in-service work. When we're starting to think about the WQTA, it's purely based on capital spending. So the projects don't have to be completed. The money has to be spent on an annual basis. So that's a significant departure from what happens with WICA. But it was needed because of, I guess, the level of spend and the fact that some of these projects are multi-year, combined with the fact that one of the goals of the legislation was to smooth things out for customers. So that's a significant difference. Other things are very much the same. It's a 60-day review process. The charge has to go in on the first day of a quarter. There's an annual reconciliation that will be filed, very much like the WICA reconciliation. The surcharge is assessed based on bills rendered as opposed to service rendered. So same thing there with WICA. Filing frequency, WICA is twice a year. This is a once a year charge when it comes to the WQTA based on annual spend. The surcharge caps are different here. WICA has a 5% annual cap. With WQTA, it's 7.5%. The between rate case caps, WICA is 10%, WQTA is 15%. So purely just out of a recognition of the amount that has to be completed over 5 years, that's why those caps were adopted. From a cost recovery, it's for the most part the same. Return on rate base, income taxes, depreciation, property taxes, but there will be some nuances on the property taxes and the depreciation, and we'll get to that a little bit later. And then the other thing is there is an earnings test associated with this. So if we exceed our authorized rate of return, or specifically ROE in a calendar year, we would not be able to proceed with the subsequent WQTA. Same earnings test that exists for WICA. There's a lot on that page. I don't know if, before we move on, if you have any questions there. No? Okay. Jump to the next one. We've talked about the timeline. That's a snapshot of what this looks like between 2025 and 2030. Roughly 200+ million of spend. So our thoughts on our timeline are we wanted to get the assessment report in as soon as possible following the passage of the legislation, so that essentially we would have approval of the assessment report by the end of the year, and we'd be able to submit our first surcharge filing based on 2025 spending at the end of January 2026 for effective April 1 of 2026. And coincident with all of that, we're talking about what's going to be best in terms of customer notifications, how we educate customers about what's coming. But that'll all be done before and on the first bill that goes to customers.
Very soft.
Sorry.
By the way.
Whereabouts do you anticipate meeting the 15% cap within there where you would
I don't think we will.
up to 2030?
No, because what'll happen is, if you accept that we're on a 3-year rate case cycle, anything would get reset at the time of a rate case. So, but even that said, the total amount of spend, I don't know that it goes beyond the 15. But also dependent upon what that next level of base rates looks like. So it's, can't be 100% certain, but it's close. So again, the idea becomes, based on this chart, there's 10 million of spend. That would be the subject of what we would file at the end of January of next year. We go to the next slide.
We could, thank you. When do you plan on starting the customer notification education process?
We're talking about it now in terms of what form that's going to take. We've, as part of our last rate case, we redesigned the bill so that there's a lot more space on that to provide information that's not lost in the fine print. There's some clear places where we can use that for messaging. So I think it's, when is that first bill going to reflect some sort of informational update? We haven't pegged a date yet.
Okay.
But I would assume it would not be too far out there because our customers are billed quarterly. So we got to make sure we get to them, at least once in advance of that first charge.
Okay, thank you.
Has the company applied for drinking water state revolving fund regarding those projects?
Yes, we have. We have applied for SRF funding for cases where there was a fit. where we had the best chance to be awarded some sort of subsidy funding. So several of those are in progress right now.
Will the amount of the money you received from drinking water state revolving fund be included in the cost of the projects that you will apply for recovery?
Yeah, this is a nuance we'll hit later, but just to cover it now, the legislation as it states puts this forward like WICA, where you have your investment times your allowed rate of return. For these projects where we have SRF funding provided, those projects would only seek cost recovery for the reduced interest rate, which is typically the 2%, and it would also reflect any subsidies. So it gets a little messy in the presentation because you can't take the total investment times the rate of return. It'll be calculated on a project by project basis because of those instances where we want to pass on that lower cost.
Just in situation that you submitted a project for cost recovery to Pura, and then you received money for drinking water state revolving fund, how would you approach this kind of situation? This is like theoretical, but
Yeah,
may happen.
I don't think there would be an instance where we would have a completed project that we're looking for cost recovery on actually, it's not completed, it's spent, right? But I don't think there will be instances where we don't know that we're seeking that SRF.
Yeah, in general, SRF requires pre-approval before they need to approve the engineering study, the plans, they give you permission to bid. So you couldn't come in at the end of that process and look for a subsidy because they hadn't been involved right from the start. So you really have to propose these projects pre-design or pre-construction, depending on what you're hoping to have SRF funding awarded for.
I guess in the rare instance where we filed a surcharge request based on, we've spent $1 million and we've assessed it based on our rate of return because we don't have any SRF in place. At that point in time, what we would be recovering would be our actual cost at that point, right? Because clearly we're funding this spending with whether it's debt or equity. Subsequent to that initial filing, if funding becomes available and we start taking advantage of that, the second year of the WQTA, which would reflect cumulative spending at that point, would then be adjusted to reflect that lower rate of return in the subsidy. So I think anything we collect will be based on what we're actually incurring as cost. And if our cost that we're incurring goes down as a result of something like SRF, we'll reflect that as it happens. Because it is like WICA, it's a rolling thing where it's a cumulative surcharge between cases. So we'll continually be able to update that.
You have two buckets of investment. I'm sorry, and I mean, SFR and non-SFR. You think on that, I think it's WIC 04 where
Yeah,
you show your calculation. Is that what you
I think,
anticipate?
yeah, so RRU4 is the question you guys put forward that sort of listed a lot of the details on the projects, right?
Mm.
Now, one of the things I was thinking about as we move forward is right now WICA has almost two sets of forms. One is sort of some detail on the project, and then in another place you have cost information.
Mm.
I'd like to see all that come together in one place. So if you have the information that's in RRU4, and then we add additional columns to reflect the cost recovery aspects of it, each project will have a calculation for its rate of return, its depreciation, whatnot. So you can have separate rate of returns for different projects for those cases where you have SRF money or subsidies applied. The only thing that happens is what's nice in WICA is you have form WICA 04, which is a nice summary. We might want to think of a way to do this summary where I could reflect two buckets. Like here's all the SRF projects, here's all the non-SRF projects, here's the subsidies. Because it's a nice, again, summary of everything that's going on in the detail, but I think we can accommodate that somehow.
Okay.
All right. So we could go to the next one, Robin. So as we think about what, and this is me a little bit brainstorming in terms of what do these surcharges look like on a going forward basis. There's going to be testimony. That testimony will cover everything from the financials and the cost recovery, but it would also cover any changes that are made to the assessment report. What's changed since the last time? What projects have we worked on and completed? Is anything different? So some very basic testimony there. We'll have the detailed calculations as we just spoke of, sort of based or foundationally on that RRU4, but then built out for cost recovery determination. And then there'll have to be the earnings test similar to the WICA filings that demonstrate that we're not over earning on our rate of return such that it would trigger non-applicability of the surcharge. But those are the kind of things that I was envisioning in terms of those filings. And I guess I look to you guys if you see any holes there or if that seems like it's inclusive of everything you would need. And I guess the premise here is that there's a WICA premise going on as well. When we think about our WICA filings, our cost or our project documentation is pretty limited, right? Because it's meant to be a 60-day process. So I don't envision that there's much here in terms of all of that work that we do in the process of a rate case, right? There's a lot of information provided up front that summarizes, I think, alternatives and different things about the project. So that was provided in the assessment report. But in terms of cost recovery, we're treating this similar to WICA in that the commission would have an ultimate prudency determination in the rate case on these projects. So I'm assuming it works the same way there. Sorry, that was long.
And just housekeeping, future semi-annual or annual WQATA
I
certificate?
keep tripping on that. It's definitely annual. I apologize.
Right. Thank you.
Right, and then if we could go to the next, I think last slide, just a couple of things I wanted to highlight here. Because we're talking about spending, that a lot of times there may not be depreciation expense recovery yet on some of these projects. The first time in, if a project's still in progress, depreciation doesn't start till after it's been completed in service. So it may be one or two WQTA filings before you see depreciation expense as a component for a particular project. So if it's not completed, you shouldn't see depreciation expense. You shouldn't see property tax. That stuff may sort of trail. And it's meant to match up to when we're incurring it ourselves. AFUDC is another awkward one because essentially once we start recovering cost, there should not be any AFUDC associated. So what will happen is there might be AFUDC on initial filings while I guess it would be the first filing. But once costs are being recovered, we're going to shut that AFUDC off so that it's not accruing on that portion of the project. It gets a little again, messy on that one. And we've talked internally about how we're going to make sure that happens. And we have an approach, but we don't want to continue to accrue AFUDC if we're getting cost recovery. And then the last one I have on here is the SRF, which we talked about. We'll make sure that's not reflected, or what we're reflecting is our true costs. So that's going to be a lower interest rate. It's going to be a subsidy. It's going to be whatever our true cost to finance these projects is. But I just wanted to highlight those because they're differences from WICA. And I want to make sure everyone sort of was on the same page with how we're thinking about treating them.
Regarding capital spent to date, as of now, we have cost of those 37 projects That's estimated cost, correct?
Yep.
Based on your experiences, how much those costs can change? I learned in WCAS that estimated cost is never the same as actual cost. So based on your experiences, what can we expect to see? 10% change, 15, 20%, or something else? Would you be able to?
So you're exactly right. These are very early, we're estimating based on very preliminary information. So it's a very broad range in potential difference for this class assessment. I think 100% and 50%, 100% high, 50% low is the range we'd give. So there could be substantial changes once we get into the design and the actual costs associated with the project. But the idea is we would update that each submission as the project became more clarified. We could refine the estimates to better reflect the actual scope. Right now, we're working a very rudimentary, so many dollars per square foot of building. We're assuming this size building based on that treatment system. So it has a high level of assumption in it right now.
But I understand that most of those projects, if not all, they are either in the design phase or after the design phase. Am I correct?
So many of the projects we've submitted initially are pre-designed. We have no design work completed on them. So we're working off of that initial implementation plan, which got us to the point where we could say we think GAC is the likely treatment approach. We think we don't have enough space in that building, so we're going to need to build a building of so many square feet at so many dollars per square feet. And we built an estimate up at that level of precision, but that'll get much more defined as we get into the actual design phase.
To the point about these, at this point, obviously, these are cost estimates only. And if I understood the application accurately, there are varying costs in some of the individual summaries of the projects. However, I believe the company stated that table 1 in the report itself is the most recent and up-to-date version of the cost estimates for each project. Is that accurate?
That's correct. And we were trying to differentiate the fact that some of these projects are in design or do have some additional level of detail beyond that initial study. So if you went project by project down the initial study, they wouldn't match one for one in every case. Some of these, we had more current information and we reflected that here. So yes, this is most current as of data filing.
Okay, thank you. And on project eligibility, I think I'm wondering if the company with the report submitted any sort of documentation regarding the eligibility of these projects. And I guess what I mean by that is referring to how the statute was written, in that these projects need to be designed to meet these federal regulations and also be exclusive of current rate base and not be eligible for WICA. And so did the company provide any documentation of the way in which these projects meet those 3 eligibility criteria per the statute?
Our intent was the project summaries would cover that. So we did provide sampling information to document that there was a regulated contaminant that had to be treated to document that test. The treatment proposed in each case is an accepted best treatment practice to address the contaminant. I guess I don't know how specific we were beyond that, but obviously through the design process, that would be to bring that to the regulatory limit. And the third test you mentioned, I think, was it would not be eligible under other proceeding.
Yeah, not currently in rate base nor eligible for WICA.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to document that. That's obviously, it would be how we proceed, but I don't know what we can provide at this point to document that.
I think the documentation that they're not currently in rate base is that they haven't been constructed yet.
Correct,
Right.
yeah.
And I think we didn't address the WICA aspect in the filing, but I think you did a pretty good job in one of your responses. It was one of the questions asked about it.
Mr. Dixon, I'm sorry to interrupt. Is your microphone on?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
So we didn't address the WICA aspect specifically in the application, but I think Mr. Peeling in one of his responses tried to draw the distinction about what would be eligible under WICA versus what would be eligible under here to basically make the point that nothing here has any WICA eligibility. There are interconnections in here, but those interconnections are new pipe versus replacement of pipe, which is a requirement under the WICA legislation.
Is Exhibit QTA 7 an example of one of such interconnection examples that you just described?
Correct.
Okay. In reviewing that one in particular, the description of water main as a water main upgrade project sparked the question of WICA eligibility and the way in which we would ensure that documentation is clear on what is or is not WICA eligible within any of these projects.
Understood. I think that's a poor choice of wording on our part. It's an upgrade as far as system upgrade to be compliant in that Green Springs system, but there is no new, or that we are not replacing any pipe. There's no portion of that would be WICA eligible. It's a new interconnection from the Guilford system to the Green Springs system.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if you apply for cost recovery for project that is partially done, and then you decide to go on different road to either not complete this project or complete differently than was proposed, how the cost will be included in the rates for people, because the project is not complete. Would you just move this money to different project? Do you think about such a situation? Or you think you will never have this kind of situation?
Unfortunately, I do think about this, but
Good.
we ever going to be going down the road of spending on a project that we're not going to use?
Substantial spending, no, but by the time we're in construction, we expect to have the full data set and have that confidence.
Yeah, so I think the answer is that if we're at a point where we're seeking cost recovery based on spending, our decision path, I think, is set at that point, and I don't think we're going to backtrack from there. Is that a fair characterization, or?
I think that's fair. It's hard to think of every possible situation, but I think that's a fair statement. So if we're incurring costs to the point where we're seeking recovery, so it's beyond initial water quality samples or tabletop assessments, if we're really in a design phase or construction phase, at that point, we would not just stop a project or change our course because we've made a determination at that point. And part of that tier 3 logic is to avoid a situation like you're describing. If it's a borderline case, let's make sure we've got that compliance data in hand so we're all comfortable that is a required project and the course we've set is necessary before we incur cost.
I guess I think of what happens in the absence of any surcharge mechanism. If we're working on a project and we spend a certain amount of money and then we abandon the project. From an accounting perspective, we write that off and we expense it and customers never pay for anything. So in that extreme example, like if that were to happen, I guess, clearly the surcharge would go to zero for that project. I guess the only, thing to consider is, if we've collected a certain amount of money, do we give that back? I think that's a very extreme example, but that would be, I guess, the consideration we'd have to come to terms with in a future filing. I can't think it would be any significant amount of money, so I think we just push it back as a credit or something, but obviously we have no intent to basically roll that to another project or something if it doesn't belong to that project. It's just some of the mechanics could get messy. I've said that a few times today, I guess.
Would you be able to reconsider this during the annual reconciliation? Would this
Whether
be
it's
possible?
whether it's the annual reconciliation or just a correction in the subsequent year's filing, timing is probably going to be similar. So either place is, seems like it's appropriate to address it if it occurs.
How would Pura know about this correction?
If that happened, I got to assume that's something that we would call out in our testimony and we would highlight it.
Thank you.
And if we're not going to proceed on a project that we've already started cost recovery on, it's going to be very clear on the forms that this has gone to zero, or it's not a complete project. It's not accumulating costs. I think it'll stand out.
Thank you.
So just going back to the forms, maybe like RU4, as taking the place of many of the forms that we currently file in the WICA process.
Yeah, it seems like it accomplishes the information that's in all of those others. So it seems like it's comprehensive from both an engineering and a project perspective. So it seemed to be appropriate to just add the recovery pieces out to the side of it.
Are you talking about going back to the WICA 4?
I'm talking about the WICO 1, 2, and 3, which are very
Yeah.
detailed project by project. So that I think gets rolled into
The 4.
4. There would be another summary page that's going to accumulate total investment, total recovered as return, depreciation. We'll somehow find a way to summarize it.
Oh, yeah, we'd have this, plus we would have the overall. I believe you said WICO 4, where we'd separate those out
Yeah.
by SAF.
SAFR.
Not SAFR, the State
Semi-annual.
Revolving Fund,
Mhm.
SRF.
Right.
Non-SRF, okay. You currently provide, let me get back to this. It's, I went and we went and took a look back at WICO 2 for your current dockets and the CJE-5, the job cost summaries. And I'm wondering those could potentially be useful. Looking at these projects, but I'm wondering about going back to the incremental nature of that RU4 and the detail behind each year's spend. You need, if something else would be required besides that, and get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, as I thought about that, I was thinking when it comes to the cost piece, it's almost as though, WQTA 01 cost information, WQTA 02, so it's an incremental value, so you can always differentiate. That way, if all of a sudden you see depreciation kick in, it becomes obvious, or It seems like there's value to adding something other than a running total, I guess is my point.
Yeah, okay.
Maybe it's just the running total compared to what it was the prior filing.
All right. Okay, something to think about and potential interrogatory.
Yeah, I was going to suggest, I mean, we could, do some sort of illustrative example and submit it to see if it checks the boxes of everything we want to see.
Okay.
So there is a housekeeping question again. This is on your attachment A, page 4. That's the report done by Hazen. And you're saying that's in second line, that Connecticut Water is serving population of about 107,000 people. Is this correct? Should not be 107,000 customers
Connections, 107,000 connections, yes.
actions. So that's the difference, because for us, a connection is equal to like on average 4 people, correct? So this should be multiplied by at least 4, this 107,000.
I think it's somewhere in the 2 to 3 is the multiplier, like 2.5 or 2.6. But yes, the population would certainly be
Okay.
a higher number, and we can modify that in our.
This is just for the future. We know this from different dockets, but in this document, this is incorrect. If I look at exhibit, this is Avon, a well number 3. That's exhibit WQTA2. And this is on page 3. The last table on page 3. It's exhibit WQTA-2, or in different, it's Avon Well 3.
I'm having trouble calling it up just because of my internet connection.
Oh,
So I don't know
okay.
if,
Sorry
as this
about
comes up, if there's anything I can speak to
Yeah.
without seeing.
So in this table number 3, or optional others/deducts, there are few negative numbers, and this is like description. It would be ion exchange DuPont in lieu of pyrrolite 694E, and that is negative $3,700. Would you please explain this negative number? Does this mean that the system recommends, but you decide not to have it, or what is it? You have like 3 negative numbers in this table.
So the structure of that table is, or these 3 tables is comparing options from this vendor. So that option 1 is up top is a unit price for the system. Option 2 gives a unit price for a GAC-based system. And then those negatives are optional reductions in scope that we could elect through the course of design. So I think in your example, they're showing that if we substituted a different media, we could save $16,000 from that lump sum price they provided under option 1 or option 2. Option 1, I guess it would be in that case.
All right, and similar situation with the next line, fluorosorbs 200 in lieu of porolite.
Correct. So that's another media option. So these are various media. And this vendor, Aqueous Vets, their core business is the vessels themselves. So those big steel. So they're basically telling us we can give you a lot of different medias in those vessels. We've priced it at an assumed media, but we can credit you off of the price we show in option 1. We can reduce by some number of $1,000s for each of those options you may choose of a different media type or a different, component to the overall system. So they're just reflecting what the final price would be likely to look like based on what we choose in the actual design process.
Okay, thank you. No my questions.
Going back to the forms, and WIO2 and 230832, you provided TMD part 1, part 2. Is that something that you provide that could give us an incremental nature of the spend to point for depreciation and property taxes? Is that those forms lend themselves to that, do you think?
Are you talking about the table at the bottom of WICA 04? Which,
It's exhibit TMD part 1, part 2, and part 3. Your the property tax in this example, and what that's how you tie it back into what's in the application, the current SAFR. So I'm wondering if that's an example of something that could capture that incremental nature for property taxes, and when these things do appear.
yeah, so that we don't overly complicate the itemization, but we add sort of, I'll say, subordinate schedules almost to support the depreciation and property taxes that illustrate how those have changed. Yeah, I think that makes sense because when I started thinking about the itemization page, it could get out of control really quick, right? If you calculate essentially a new surcharge level each year. So subordinate schedules might be a good solution to that. And I think it's just on those two pieces, right?
You want us to pull that up on the screen so you're
Yeah,
familiar
sure.
with it?
Yeah. I think those times. The one thing, we were just talking about is, I think a lot of the detailed TMD schedules are really duplicative in a lot of ways. So I've been trying to think of a way to not overly complicate the schedule, but give the information. Like these property tax ones, to me, are very redundant in terms of the information that's there. But I certainly hear your point about being able to demonstrate change from one filing to another. Yeah, but so you're talking about like columns 8, 9, and 10, just purely demonstrating this is what it is calculates now versus what it was before? Yeah, I think we can I think a lot of the, I think a lot of the duplication that I'm speaking of is in some of these prior columns, so we can probably eliminate a bunch of that, but still get at the ultimate end goal of showing the rate of change.
We don't have any further questions, so thank you for walking us through the presentation, unless there's anything further that you all would like to add about the filing, the application.
No, we're just happy to have the chance here to sort of talk this through a little bit more informally so we can, I don't know, get a little bit of alignment as to how this works going forward. So if it helps to provide those illustrative schedules, happy to do that and get those in. I can wait for the interrogatory, but I'll start working on them.
Very good. Well, thank you for the presentation. Thank you for answering our questions. And Attorney Bowman, that's all the authority staff have here.
All right, does anybody have any administrative matters? So this schedule for this docket is still very much a work in progress, so we will update that accordingly. So stay tuned. And barring anything else, seeing none, we're adjourned.
Thank you. All right.